Coming up, a look at the top political risks for 2013.
If you look at our top risks from 1 to 10 across the board in 2013, the big things we're worried about are largely emerging market risks.
Eurasia Group's Ian Bremmer shares his annual list and discusses uncertainty in China, American stability, and much more. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Today I have the great pleasure of introducing Ian Bremmer, who will talk about his company's top risks for 2013 and the ethical implications of those risks. Ian has released these risks every year for about a decade after he started the Eurasia Group, and it is our 5th year of having the pleasure of hosting him here.
The big change from 2012 to 2013, there is a little bit of a tipping point. The financial crisis, we finally kind of put it in the rearview mirror. For 4 years, all of the risks that we've been talking about have been firmly in the context of post-financial crisis. You kept hearing those sentences. Post-financial crisis, the Eurozone is imploding. Post-financial crisis, the U.S. has gotten downgraded. And are we keeping our banks in order? And will there be a double-dip recession? And debt-mageddon and even fiscal cliff. Post-financial crisis, the Japanese have this extraordinary debt burden, and can they make it through? And a third lost decade, and Fukushima, they're going to get washed into the sea. Post-financial crisis. There's something interesting about that entire conversation, which it all involves developed states. It all involves advanced industrial democracies. And the interesting thing about that is every single one of those risks, political risks, have been overstated in the media. Every single one. But the point is that developed states are fundamentally more resilient. They're fundamentally more stable. In fact, I think the interesting thing about 2013 as the post-financial crisis year, the first year that really we're talking about, okay, where are we today, is that the developed states, we may be overstating the risk, but in the emerging markets, we are systematically understating the risk. So go back to the U.S. election in November. How many times on the newspapers did you see people in the media say that corporations were keeping trillions of dollars on the sidelines in the U.S., from the U.S., because they did not know what was going to happen with the elections? There was so much profound uncertainty with Obama versus Romney that they were keeping trillions of dollars on the sidelines. Now, first of all, I never believed it was true. But leave that aside, how many times have you heard that corporations were leaving trillions of dollars or even billions of dollars on the sidelines because they did not understand how unstable or uncertain the future for China was going to be? Has anyone ever said that? They just put money in. Why? Because it's growing. Do we care about the uncertainty? That's fine. I think that when we talk about a world where 2/3 of the growth presently comes from emerging markets, and by 2020 it's going to be 3/4, and China by itself, we talk about the BRICS. Everyone loves to talk about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and just for fun, South Africa. Just for fun, for kicks, okay? The size of the Chinese economy is larger than Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa all put together. So let's stop talking about BRICS. And let's understand that when we talk about the level of uncertainty in emerging market growth going forward, even though Brazil looks better than it did before, we're talking about China. And that uncertainty is huge. And if you look at our top risks from 1 to 10 across the board in 2013, the big things we're worried about are largely emerging market risks. In terms of whether I see the world moving in a better or a worse direction, let me just go through a quick list of all of the things that we see in the risk report. What's good? What's bad? Where do I come out? Good. No surprise to anyone here. U.S. stability. The fact of the matter is that an increasingly large share of the world's energy, the largest producer of the world's food, the critical technologies that are being developed happen to be in the world's largest economy, but also happen to be in a place that's very stable, that has rule of law, that is wealthy. That is an advantage. Second big positive, Africa. 1.2 billion people in a land mass that's bigger, much bigger than India and China combined. They're getting it right. They're not getting it right hugely quickly, but they're getting it right. Most of the African governments are improving in their governance. 50% of the African continent is urbanized. Only 20% of growth in GDP comes from commodities. That's a very positive story. It's only going to get much more positive going forward. Not without extraordinary hardship and corruption and famine and warfare. Certainly, it's Africa, it's poor, but it is not the lost continent. It will not be the lost continent again. Relatedly, rise of the middle classes. Rise of the middle classes across the world, the extraordinary reality that we have increasingly so many folks from very different backgrounds, very different kinds of education that can be an active part of the global economy, not just as consumers, but also in helping to come up with solutions to global problems. That is an enormous amount of international talent that largely will alleviate poverty and largely will be a force for good and needs to be seen as such, even if the American middle class is shrinking. American boats will be risen by the rise of the global middle class as global challenges require global solutions. Technology. Productivity, progress, absolutely, but also more people with information in their hands and more diffusion away from large concentrated areas and individuals being able to affect change. You look at a place like India or Indonesia and you see how individuals in local areas are able to band together, learn about local corruption, do something about it, overturn an official that's been a kleptocrat or a nepotist, or most likely both. Those are very positive developments in terms of technology. I'll get back to technology in a second because there's a lot of downside. Then the final upside that I found was conflict aversion. When I was a PhD student listening to Essence of Decision, Graham Allison, and talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy saying that there was a 1 in 3 chance that we were going to have global thermonuclear war, I never bought it. And I didn't buy it because we weren't talking about when push really had come to shove, and Khrushchev would have given it a second and a third and a fourth thought before he pushed that button. And God forbid he pushed it. It wasn't automatic that Kennedy was going to respond. Kennedy would have been thinking about what he was doing and the implications and what that meant for him, and he was gone anyway. We're not theory. We're not computer programs. We're human beings, and ultimately that's probably the only good reason to truly be an optimist over the long term. What do I see as downside? Well, it shouldn't surprise you. The single biggest piece of downside is China. Again, not because China is evil, but because the level of uncertainty of China is enormous, because the needs of the Chinese government and its system as they grow will be immensely disruptive from a climate perspective, from a resource consumption perspective, from a territorial and security perspective, and also because they do not have similar political or economic systems or values as the advanced industrial democracies, and therefore they will be disruptive with the way the global order is formed. That's number one. Number two, generally inequality. The rise of inequality across the world in many, many countries, of course, but here I'm talking specifically about the US and about Europe. And the reason for that is because absent being addressed, even though the US and Europe is a good story, you're going to have a larger number of people that do not believe that globalization benefits them. And if they have a voice and they're empowered by technology, as they will be, then you will have political forces that rise up and represent them and take advantage of that. And that is likely to lead to policy making that moves against engagement internationally, against globalism, instead moves towards fragmentary decision making, and is much more problematic for economic harmony. Related to that is the illegitimacy of political elites across the world. A big trend that we see is incumbents don't do very well. Merkel is a very interesting exception, and the support for rule of law and political process in Germany is something we should all be proud of. I actually thought Merkel would have been a better choice for Time Person of the Year this year, especially because the maintenance of the Eurozone is so strongly on her shoulders with about 70% approval ratings right now, despite having bailed out the the shiftless Greeks and the lazy Spaniards, right? But generally, the illegitimacy of political elites is growing. And of course, we see this as the Eurozone gets stronger, the strength of political elites in the peripheral European economies is deteriorating dramatically. And we're seeing this with, of course, Italy and Greece and Spain and Portugal and the like. You see this with 14% approval ratings for Congress in the United States and probably dropping as I speak, certainly over the course of this year. You see this not only in the Arab summer, but also in places like Russia and China. Technology, the downside of technology. The first billion people that got their hands on internet were generally folks that were really interested in advancing, at least passively, liberal causes, liberal democracy and the rest. I don't mean liberal in the US sense, I mean more in the classical sense. The next billion people getting their hands on the internet are poorer. Many are more disenfranchised. The next billion after that, even more so. The internet, like everything else involved in technology, is a magnifier. It is an amplifier. It takes what you have and it gives it to you in a bigger way. You give someone the right to vote, they will let you know more effectively what their interests are. You give them a modem, you give them a smartphone, they will let you know more effectively what their interests are. If their interests are sectarian, if their primary identity is sectarian, they will let you know much more effectively how to implement that. That will cause more conflict in those areas. So in many cases, the growth of the internet will lead to much more nationalism, much more populism, much more sectarianism, much more violence. And I think that's something we have to be aware of. It's not just against political elites, but also person on person, neighbor on neighbor, community on community. I also worry on the technology front about how even though the information revolution empowers individuals, the data revolution does not. The data revolution empowers collectives, corporations, and increasingly states. Those organizations are likely to use that information in ways that encroach on personal liberty. In the case of some countries, they will likely do it in the way that enhances their own collective security at the direct expense of their citizenry. That is absolutely not a move towards a World Wide Web. It is a move away from a World Wide Web. I saw Zuckerberg a few months ago when he got his 1 billionth user. And they said, well, what's your goal? He said, well, I want to have 7 billion users. We have 7 billion people. I want all of them connected, which is a wonderful idea, but it's enormously outdated because you've got, in 2015, you'll have 800 million Chinese users that will have absolutely no interest in Facebook. That is appropriate. If I were Chinese, I would not want to have Facebook in my country. They have entirely too much data and influence. That's going to change the way we think about information in the World Wide Web. So information versus data is one that should give us a bit of pause before we jump on the technology/progress equals unmitigated good for this short period of time. Finally, I talked about the structural upside being conflict aversion in humanity. I think the structural downside, not surprisingly, is the G0. The idea that we are in this period of geopolitical creative destruction, the absence of global leadership, where the U.S. isn't doing it, but no one else will either. Syria is the poster child for the G0, but think about what Obama said. He says, we're going to start focusing on building our own nation for a while. After World War II, could you imagine the United States saying, we're going to focus on building our own nation for a while? Inconceivable. Because we had to build Europe, we had to build Japan, we had to create a new order. Well, the challenges facing the world are no less serious today, and yet we are focused overwhelmingly on our domestic society. Now, I am not blaming Obama for this. Let us be clear. If Romney were the president, he would be doing the same thing. Global issues will become more important to us. That is a place that you want to be, gravitationally. It is coming to us. There's no question, but we're not there yet. And as long as we're not there, this is absolutely a negative. And it's not just us. It's everybody else out there. Where do I come out as a consequence of this? Interesting. I gave us a lot of thought this weekend. I come out more positive. Many of the negative trends, it's easier to see the way that they might actually start to change. It's easier to see over the next 5 years how, despite all of our concerns about China, the top leaders of the Chinese government will see that this is a real problem and will have a Gorbachev moment. It's easier to see how that is possible. It is harder to see how in the next 5 years US resilience will fundamentally go up in flames. It is easier to see bold decisions made by American policymakers and European policymakers that start to actually redress inequality and move in a different direction than it is to see how Africa is going to just no longer grow and not develop. It's harder to see that. It is easier to see how political elites can regain some of their legitimacy, even though that's not my baseline case, than it is to see how the middle classes around the world will stop aspiring and growing. And it's even easier to see an end to the G0 than it is to see an end in the fundamental conflict aversion and ultimate desire to strive and get better of us. So for that reason, I end up a little bit more positive.
What does the rise of China mean for universal values, generally speaking? How does that shape the way we think about ethics in international affairs, just generally speaking?
I am challenged by the notion of American values as universal. I mean, I certainly believe that there are some values that are universal, sure. The one thing I can say very clearly, that the United States is thankfully at a stage of development that we are able to articulate and promote values that have largely been better for the majority of the world's citizens than those that would have been promoted by most, though not all, other countries in the world. If I think about where we are on gay rights in the United States right now, for example, or even on women's rights in the United States, for example, maternity issues and equal pay and all of that, the U.S. is moving, but there are certainly other countries that I think we would say if you wanted to be universalist, you might have a different argument, of course. If you want to be universalist and you were in Saudi Arabia, even as a woman, you might take some offense with some of those concepts. I'm not someone who, I don't believe as an American in going around and lecturing people about the universalism of our values. I do believe that because we're in a position that we can actually do good, it is really important that we exercise more humility around where we screw up. And it hurts if you're the guy talking about human rights when you consistently do things that upset the apple cart there. It hurts or when you do them outside your country because it's legally expedient. And even though I know the reasons for that, the point is that American exceptionalism gets you into trouble when you do that. As someone who does political risk, it hurts just as much when you talk about the universalism of America as a free market economy, and then you have the financial crisis or Madoff or the Enron scandal and WorldCom and all the rest. It hurts. And one thing I believe we need our kids to better understand is why it is that folks from different countries believe that our system is corrupt. We do not believe that we are as corrupt as any emerging market out there. We don't believe it. And yet many emerging markets would look at the system that's been set up, which is legal in the United States, looks at the role of money in the election, looks at the Supreme Court ruling on treating corporations as individuals, looks at all of this stuff and would say that our system is corrupt. And I am not suggesting that we should agree with them. I don't believe that. But I think we need to understand them.
If China were a stock and the United States were a stock, and taking all the risks that you've outlined here, which would you invest in?
I mean, I think there's no question at all that if I was forced to choose between one or the other, I would choose the United States, and I'd do it all day long. Now, I'd do that in part because I'm risk averse. Here's the fundamental problem I have with China. We used to talk about the average Chinese. The average Chinese was happy about the Chinese government. The average Chinese was happy with growth. The average Chinese needs 8% growth. Increasingly, there are two Chinas. right? There is a China that is rural or urban poor, and they really are perfectly fine with the government such as it is unless someone directly treads on them, and they just want more growth and more redistribution. That's what they want. So China can keep doing exactly what they've done for them. But then you have Chinese that are actually in the information economy. They're working in front of a computer all day long. They're urban. They've got a Weibo account. They're microblogging. And those people are less affected by growth. Those people are much more affected by what's the product safety? And can I breathe outside? And is my government lying to me? Are they accountable to me? These things fundamentally matter as they're getting up the value chain. These things don't get easier, they get harder. Now that would imply that if you want to govern China effectively, you need a system that is somewhat more federal. You need a system that, just like you've got, red state, blue state in the United States, and we have different policies on, whether it's gay marriage or legalization of marijuana or what have you. And Colorado is different from Alabama. Should not surprise us, right? That is, right? I mean, San Francisco municipal codes, until recently, you could walk around nude. Last thing I noticed, you couldn't do that in Savannah. But the point of China, right, is that if there's one thing this government is showing absolutely no capability or willingness of doing, it is actually fundamentally differentiating their policy approach towards those two Chinas. Now that may change, but everything I've seen about the leadership transition, 9 to 7, right? Hu Jintao stepping down from his military post faster, Li Keqiang, prime minister post, being elevated from number 3 to number 2. I mean, all of these things about consolidation. Well, these 7 guys that all seem to be very, very focused on ensuring that no nail is sticking up. That fundamentally worries me. So again, get to that. My response is, do I really want to make big bets on China? And of course, it's a more complex question than that. There are many places that you can make enormous amounts of money in China. Those investments are smart, and I would never tell people that are invested there, no, you should take all of your money out. That's crazy. But if you asked me a simple question, so I'm trying to make it more black and white, I know what side of the coin I end up on there.
I would like to know, because you mentioned that the rebalance of power at the global level towards emerging markets is moving, is like the tendency is to move slowly. And I would like to know what is determining the space.
Well, it's not failure of the EMs. There are basically 4 fundamental reasons why we're sort of in the geopolitical fix we're in right now. Number 1, too many countries, right? It's just harder to coordinate when you have lots of countries that matter. Simple coordination. Number 2, these emerging market countries are different. They have different values, different preferences. They're poor. They have different political and economic systems. Therefore, they're not bad, but it's not the rise of the rest. The rise of the different. They don't agree with us, and so it's harder to put things together, right? Number 3, these emerging markets do not have the capacity or the experience, not because they failed. They've just never done global before. They're new. I mean, I love this one statistic. India has as many diplomats, 1.1 billion people, has as many diplomats as New Zealand, okay? We never expect New Zealand to do anything for global trade. We expect the Indians to. They literally don't have the capacity.
Last year when I was in China, also during the past years, I feel it was a huge amount of insecurity among people. And Chinese are people who don't reveal our doubts and fear to the outside world. So when everyone thinks the country is hold up tight and the economy is well, people are really doubting that how long it can last and and all the risks and the inequality in the country. And then this year, I think actually things are changing. Actually, people are very happy about the new leadership because a lot of political reforms are happening. The middle class who have the economic power are actually trying to, reform in a way that it's subtle. It doesn't hurt anyone's interest, but it's going towards democracy. And I think the middle class in China actually have a closer value to the so-called universal value of the Western world because they're more exposed to what is going on nowadays. And that they are economically empowered.
I actually accept the fact that in the middle classes, you increasingly have people in China that support rule of law, that support an independent judiciary, that support intellectual property rights. And I said at the beginning I was ultimately more optimistic because I could see more ways over time that China would be able to actually change its model and take some of the risk out, then I saw the U.S. falling apart. It made me more optimistic. And one of the biggest reasons for that is precisely because the middle classes are moving in that direction. Look, if you ask me to put a likelihood on the good outcome in China, that the middle class gets it right, is able to truly convince the Chinese leadership in a peaceful and harmonious way that they need to start fundamentally opening their political system and dismantling state capitalism in a way that makes it more efficient and deals with robotics and all the rest, what is the likelihood they will do that in the next 10 years? At best, it's 50-50. At best, it's I can't get there. And in the next 5 years with the existing leadership, a year ago, I didn't know. I now know, and it's a hell of a lot less. I might put it at 10%, given who they are and what they're doing, and the way they reacted to the initial demonstrations against censorship we saw early on. I mean, you talk about the Chinese middle classes having more universalist values. I got to tell you, the average Chinese leader worth over $1 billion, I do not believe shares those universalist values. I don't. And I'm not even saying that they're the right values. But whatever they are, they ain't sharing them. I thank all of you very, very much.
Perfect, Ian. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.